You've taken a tour of the King's airplanes on display there, the Lisa Marie and the Hound Dog too, but did you ever even know this Elvis jet existed?
After 48 years of silence, Elvis Presley's forgotten private jet was finally reopened in the New Mexico desert. From the outside, it looked completely dead. But what investigators found hidden beyond the dust was something no one expected. Secret recordings untouched for decades and preserved in a way that almost felt wrong to see. And when the truth was finally out, it left people asking what had been sitting in that dark cabin all these years. Inside Elvis's forgotten jet. Elvis Presley's private jet did not look like a treasure when people found it sitting in the New Mexico desert. It looked tired, faded, and almost forgotten, with a red and silver body burned by years of sun and wind. The metal looked dull. The windows looked still. The whole plane seemed frozen in place, as if it had landed one day and never found a reason to move again. The strangest part was that the outside and inside seemed to tell two different stories. From the outside, it looked like a dead machine. Its engines were gone. Many cockpit parts had been removed. Behind that worn body was a piece of Elvis's world that still felt strangely alive. The passenger area still had red velvet upholstery, wood cabin paneling, and gold finish hardware. The look was bold, warm, and deeply tied to the 1970s, the kind of style that made even a private aircraft feel like a lounge built for fame. The aircraft sat at Roswell International Air Center in Roswell, New Mexico, about 5 miles south of the city. The location had a strange feel because Roswell itself has a name people connect with secrets in the desert. During World War II, the field was known as Roswell Army Airfield. During the Cold War, it became Walker Air Force Base. When that base closed in 1967, the site later became Roswell International Air Center. That setting made the abandoned jet feel eerie. Roswell had wide open space, old military routes, aircraft work, storage areas, and dry desert air. A dry climate can help slow some kinds of decay, which is one reason aircraft often end up stored in places like this. But even with that dry air, time still leaves a mark. Dust settles, rubber dries, paint fades, metal loses its shine. A jet can survive and still look punished. This aircraft was a 1962 Lockheed 1329 Jetstar. Elvis bought this Jetstar on December 22, 1976. The price was $840,000, a huge amount at the time. In today's money, it is about $4.4 million. That price alone tells you that this was not a small toy bought for show. The Jetstar was a serious private aircraft from a time when private jet travel was still rare, expensive, and tied to people with huge money or power. For Elvis, a jet like this was more than transport. It was privacy. It was an escape. It was a way to move without being swallowed by crowds everywhere he went. But this particular plane is often confused with another famous Elvis aircraft. This was not the Lisa Marie, the well-known Convair 880 displayed at Graceland. The Lisa Marie became the aircraft most fans connect with Elvis because it was larger, more famous, and more closely tied to the public image of his flying life. The Roswell Jetstar was separate. It had its own identity, its own records, and its own strange path into silence. Inside, the cabin still showed why the plane drew so much attention. There were 6 passenger chairs with swivel and recline functions. There was a couch. The cabin could seat up to 9 occupants. There were window shades that made the space feel private, almost sealed away from the outside world. The onboard lavatory had a vanity, a small detail that made the jet feel less like a basic aircraft and more like a moving room built for comfort. The old entertainment gear made it even stranger. A Kenmore microwave was still part of the cabin. There was a television with an RCA VCR player. There was an audio cassette player. Some seats had headphone ports with audio controls, a feature that once would have made the cabin feel modern and personal. These were not frightening objects by themselves. A microwave is just a microwave. A VCR is just a VCR. But inside a stripped, grounded Elvis jet left in the desert for decades, they felt like pieces from another life that never fully disappeared. But the strangest part is that this forgotten Jetstar only makes sense once you understand what Elvis was doing with airplanes in the final years of his life. Elvis's private world in the sky. By the mid-1970s, Elvis Presley could not move through the world like an ordinary man. A short trip could turn into a crowd. A hotel lobby could become a scene. A quiet arrival could turn loud before he even reached the door. He still had concerts to reach, band members to move, staff to manage, business pressure to carry, and personal trips that could happen without much warning. For Elvis, airplanes were not toys for a rich star. They were part of how his life kept moving. His world stretched from Memphis to Las Vegas, from Lake Tahoe to recording rooms, from one concert city to the next. The sky gave him speed, privacy, and control. The best-known piece of that flying life was the Lisa Marie. Elvis bought the 1958 Convair 880 in April 1975 and named it after his daughter. It was not treated like a normal aircraft. Elvis spent more than $800,000 remodeling it, turning it into something that felt closer to a private home than a plane. Inside the Lisa Marie were rooms made for the way Elvis lived and worked. It had a living room, a conference room, a sitting room, and a private bedroom. The details were bold and expensive, just like the image people expected from him. There were gold-plated seatbelts, suede chairs, leather-covered tables, and sinks with 24-karat gold flecks. Every part of it seemed built to say that Elvis was not simply traveling, he was carrying his own world with him. That is why fans often call it a flying Graceland. It was a mansion in the sky, built for comfort, privacy, meetings, rest, and the strange rhythm of life around a global star. It gave Elvis a place to sit with his inner circle, make plans, relax between cities, and step away from the rush that followed him everywhere. But the Lisa Marie was only one part of the picture. Elvis also had a smaller Lockheed Jetstar that became known as Hound Dog II. That aircraft is also displayed at Graceland, and it had its own bright yellow and green interior. It did not carry the same public weight as the Lisa Marie, but it had an important job. It was mainly used to carry Elvis's manager and staff from city to city during concert tours. There was Elvis himself, the TCB Band, backup groups, Colonel Tom Parker, and members of the Memphis Mafia. A concert was not just one man stepping onto a stage. It was a moving world of people, equipment, plans, calls, pressure, and money. The planes helped keep that world in motion. This is where the Roswell Jetstar starts to stand apart. It was also a Lockheed Jetstar. But unlike the two aircraft people now see at Graceland, it did not end up as a polished part of the Elvis exhibit. Elvis bought it late in his life, on December 22, 1976. It was sold in spring 1977. After later ownership changes, it eventually ended up with a Saudi Arabian company and was moved to Roswell International Air Center for storage. That path made it the odd one out. The Lisa Marie became a famous museum piece. Hound Dog II stayed connected to the Graceland story. But the Roswell Jetstar became something stranger. An Elvis plane separated from the shrine, left far from Memphis, and turned into a quiet relic in the New Mexico desert. The aircraft itself had a strong name behind it. Lockheed introduced the Jetstar model in September 1957, and it became one of the leading business jets of its time. Earlier, Jetstars used 4 Pratt & Whitney JT-12 engines mounted in 2 rear pods. It could reach about 565 miles per hour and had a range of about 2,500 miles. This was not a small private plane meant for short hops and easy attention. It was built for powerful people who needed to cross long distances quickly, in comfort, away from public view. In the 1970s, that kind of travel still felt rare and untouchable. And once that flying world is clear, the timing of this Jetstar becomes harder to ignore, because Elvis bought it during the final stretch of his life. The last jet before Elvis died. Elvis bought the Roswell Jetstar on December 22, 1976, less than 8 months before his death. That timing gives the plane a strange weight. It was not bought in the early days when he was young, sharp, and changing American music. It came near the end when his name was still huge, his schedule was still moving, and his body was already showing signs that the pace had become too heavy. In late 1976, Elvis was still working. On October 29th and 30th, he recorded inside the den at Graceland, the room many people later called the Jungle Room. Those sessions included Way Down, which would become his last single. Instead of going to a studio, the studio came to him. Recording gear was brought into his home, and Elvis recorded music inside the place where he lived and rested. Even then, the tours continued. He performed in November, keeping the show on the road as fans kept coming. In December, he played the Hilton in Las Vegas for the last time. That city had been a major part of his later career, a place where Elvis could still pull crowds and command a stage. At the end of December, he went back on tour again. The year closed with a New Year's Eve concert in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was a huge ending to a hard year. The kind of night that still made Elvis look unstoppable. The Roswell Jetstar had been bought just days before that show. It entered his world while he was still expected to keep showing up. Then came 1977. Elvis toured in February, beginning the year the same way he had lived much of the previous one, moving from city to city with his people around him. In March, he went to Hawaii for a vacation. It should have been a break before the next push, but by March 23rd he was touring again, with dates running through March 30th. The warning signs became harder to ignore in April. Elvis was hospitalized in Memphis, and shows scheduled from March 31st through April 3rd were canceled. For a performer whose world had been built around getting to the next stage, canceled shows carried a clear message. The body that had powered so many years of fame was struggling. Still, the work did not stop. Elvis returned to touring from April 21st through late May and into early June. The pattern was brutal in its own quiet way. Rest, travel, perform, recover, and then start again. The plane belonged to that world. It was tied to the same movement, pressure, and need to keep the operation alive. By June, the final stretch had arrived. Way Down was released that month and reached number 18. It sounded like proof that Elvis was still present in the music world, still able to send a song into the charts, still able to reach people beyond the concert hall. But the release came as his live schedule moved toward its final stop. From June 17th to June 26th, Elvis toured again. 3 shows from that run, on June 19th, 20th, and 21st, were recorded by RCA and filmed for the TV special Elvis in Concert. The cameras showed something no one could ignore. Elvis could still sing with power, but his health was clearly getting worse. On June 26, 1977, Elvis stepped onto the stage at Market Square Arena in Indianapolis. It became his final concert. The crowd saw the King one last time, even though no one in that building could fully know they were watching the end of his life as a live performer. When the show was over, there was no clean goodbye. There was just another concert finished, another city behind him, and another tour expected. After that night, Elvis returned to Memphis. He relaxed at Graceland and prepared for the next leg of touring. In July, his album Moody Blue was released. The title now feels almost too fitting, because the period carried a strange mix of movement and sadness. The records were still coming. The plans were still there. The fans were still waiting. Nothing outside looked finished. On August 16, 1977, Elvis was supposed to fly to Portland, Maine later that night. He was scheduled to perform there on August 17th, and the next tour was already close enough that travel plans had begun. He was still expected to leave Memphis, get on a plane, arrive in another city, and perform for another crowd. Instead, Elvis died at Graceland on August 16th. He was 42 years old. His death was recorded as heart failure, and the shock moved fast across the world. Fans waiting for another show were suddenly facing the end of the man they had followed for decades. That is what makes the Roswell Jetstar so haunting. It did not belong to a life that had already slowed down and closed itself off. It belonged to a life still packed with dates, flights, albums, tickets, staff, and expectations. It was part of a world that still believed there would be another departure, another stage, another night under the lights. Then everything stopped. But after Elvis was gone, the strangest part of the Jetstar's story was just beginning. The jet nobody could fly. By the time people began calling it the Lost Elvis Jet, the Jetstar could not do the one thing it had been made to do. It could not fly. Its Pratt & Whitney engines were gone. Many cockpit parts had also been removed. No spare engines came with it. No clean pile of missing parts waited nearby, ready to be put back in place. Even moving it became a problem. This was not a jet someone could fuel, inspect, and fly away. It was a famous aircraft trapped by its own condition, valuable because of its name, but almost useless as a working plane. Elvis had sold it in spring 1977. The plane had passed through other hands and later ended up with a Saudi Arabian company. At some point, it was moved to Roswell International Air Center in New Mexico, where it stayed for decades. What kept it from becoming just another forgotten plane was the paperwork. The sale materials included a copy of the aircraft security agreement signed by Elvis Presley. They also included a copy of the aircraft bill of sale and official FAA blue ribbon documents. Those papers gave the aircraft something collectors care about deeply: proof. They tied the Jetstar to Elvis in a clear way, and that made the aircraft far more than an old stripped business jet. Without that paper trail, it could have been dismissed as another damaged airplane parked too long in the desert. In 2017, the Jetstar came back into the public eye when businessman Jim Gagliardi of Madera, California, bought it at auction. The price was reported as $498,000. Gagliardi had a simple plan. He wanted to move the jet to his earth-moving equipment dealership and use it as a display, something big and unusual that people could walk into and remember. But that plan never happened. The aircraft stayed in Roswell. It was too large to move easily and too incomplete to move like a normal plane. Gagliardi later said he never visited the aircraft during the 6 years he owned it. So even after the sale, the lost Elvis jet remained where it had been, still grounded, still weathered, still waiting for someone to do more than buy it. Then in 2023, the aircraft showed up again at Meckham's Kissimmee sale in Florida. The timing brought even more attention to the sale. The jet was sold on January 8, 2023, which would have been Elvis's 88th birthday. Priscilla Presley was there too, making the moment feel even more tied to Elvis's legacy. The auction had the feeling of a strange rescue attempt. On one side was the battered reality of the aircraft. On the other side was the pull of the Elvis name and the rare chance to own something tied to the King's private life. A telephone bidder won with a hammer price of $260,000. With fees, the reported total came to $286,000. That was a huge drop from what Gagliardi had paid years earlier. Then came the twist. The winning bidder did not become the person who finally saved it. After that deal fell through, businessman and aviation YouTuber James "Jimmy" Webb stepped in. Webb bought the aircraft for $234,000. He saw a famous aircraft that had reached a point where normal rescue no longer made sense. Webb had the Jetstar taken apart and moved out of Roswell. And once Webb got the Jetstar out of Roswell, the story took a turn nobody expected. Elvis's dead aircraft was about to become a road machine. The birth of the Elvismobile. James "Jimmy" Webb estimated that it could cost nearly $6 million to make the Jetstar safe to fly again. Replacing the engines was not a simple shopping trip. The aircraft also had parts issues, rule problems, and noise concerns that made a return to flight almost impossible. The truth was clear. The sky was no longer its future, so the choice became strange but clear. The Jetstar could stay a dead aircraft, slowly aging as a rare Elvis object, or it could be given a new life on the ground. Webb, known through his Jimmy's World YouTube channel, chose the second path. If the plane could not fly people through the air, he would turn it into something people could still see, enter, and follow across the country. The work began at Roswell. Webb's team dismantled the aircraft piece by piece, and the process showed just how long it had been sitting. They found decades of dust, debris, bird nests, and broken plane parts. The aircraft came apart from nose to tail. Every major section had to be handled with care because the plane was still tied to Elvis, but it was also too large and too incomplete to move like a normal aircraft. Once the pieces were ready, the Jetstar began a cross-country journey from New Mexico to Florida, where the next stage of its second life would begin. On the way, it made a stop at Graceland. Webb said that moment placed all three Elvis jets at the same location for the first time. But the visit did not last. The group had not arranged permission to bring the aircraft there, and security told them it had to leave, so the Jetstar moved on again. The final idea was bold. Webb attached the Jetstar to a 1999 Freightliner motorhome chassis and called the finished machine the Elvismobile. It was no longer a regular aircraft, but it was not a regular vehicle either. It was a private jet body riding on the road, a strange mix of rock and roll history, lost aviation glory, and road trip madness. In 2024, the Elvismobile reached EAA Air Venture Oshkosh in Wisconsin by road. The trip from Florida to Wisconsin covered about 1,600 miles, turning the aircraft into a rolling scene everywhere it went. The numbers made it even stranger. The finished road machine had a gross weight of 22,220 pounds. It had 12 seats. It could cruise at about 65 miles per hour. On the trip to AirVenture, it got around 11.5 miles per gallon. That is a long way from what the Jetstar was built to be. But somehow, the sight became harder to ignore. A private jet once meant to rise above traffic was now moving inside it. Then came the moment that made the old jet feel alive again. When they plugged in ground power, the television, VCR, microwave, and lights turned on after decades without power. By 2025, the Elvis mobile was no longer hidden away. It was spotted driving through regular traffic in Bentonville, Arkansas. But turning Elvis's jet into a road machine raised one last question. Was this a rescue, or was it the destruction of a piece of music history? The Elvis jet controversy. Elvis Presley's old Jetstar was too damaged to fly, but too tied to Elvis to feel ordinary. To some people, putting it on the road looked like a rescue. To others, it looked like cutting into a piece of national history and changing it forever. Webb said Elvis fans and aviation fans usually gave him one of two reactions. Some saw him as the villain, the man who had destroyed something that should have been protected. Others loved the idea because he was saving a dead aircraft and giving it new life. The preservation argument is easy to understand. This was a real Elvis-owned aircraft, with original details still inside and documents that tied it directly to him. It was connected to the final stretch of his life, when his world was still moving through concerts, staff, travel, and pressure. To many fans, that makes every surviving part feel important. The seats, the walls, the old cabin style, and even the shape of the aircraft itself carried history. So when people heard that the plane had been mounted onto a motorhome chassis, the shock made sense. A private jet is not supposed to become a road vehicle. A rare Elvis object is not supposed to be cut, rebuilt, and driven through traffic. For those who care most about keeping history untouched, the whole thing felt wrong. But the rescue argument is just as hard to ignore. The Jetstar had already sat for decades. It had no engines. Many cockpit parts were gone. The aircraft had been exposed, weathered, and left in a condition that made a real return to flight almost impossible. Keeping it untouched might have sounded respectful, but it could also have meant letting it keep falling apart where fewer people would ever see it. Then came another sharp turn. The wings could not be used in the road conversion. Webb said those wings became a way to help pay for the project. Parts of them were cut into small tokens that came with certificates of authenticity, a copy of the bill of sale from when Elvis bought the plane, and a photo of the aircraft when Webb got it out of New Mexico. The tokens cost $329 each, or $529 if mounted with a bill of sale. That changed the Jetstar again. It was no longer only one aircraft. It was becoming pieces of memorabilia, small fragments of a larger story. For some people, that made the rescue feel more troubling. For others, it meant fans could own a real piece of an aircraft that might otherwise have stayed out of reach. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.